You're listening to Orange Blaze, a Florida Trail podcast.
It's such a special area. And yeah, I started learning about it through going to talks at the Native Plant Society and then researching and reading more about it. And I was just so shocked to realize that grew up and was living in such a special biodiverse area.
That was Lilly Anderson-Messec, botanist, horticulturist, and native plant advocate. And I'm Misty Ridley Little, Florida Trail thru hiker and host of the podcast. I can't pinpoint exactly when I began following Lily's Instagram feed, but over the last few years, her feed has been filled with the botanical wonders of Florida's Big Bend region, which encompasses the area of St. Mark's National Wildlife Refuge and Apalachicola National Forest, as well as many other areas. Her attention to detail between botanical species, as well as the knowledge she imparted in her Instagram stories, drew me in, as I'm also someone interested in native plants of various ecoregions. One aspect of the Florida Trail that I try to hone in on for people coming to the trail is to recognize the incredible biodiversity within the state, to look beyond the wet and dry, and see how the landscapes work together. Many people focus in on places like Everglades National Park, which is a gorgeous national wonder in itself, but forget that other regions of Florida, including the oft-forgotten area of North Florida, hold incredible amounts of plant diversity. There is always something to learn from what Lily shares, and this episode was no different. I know that even Floridians will learn something new in this episode. Oh, and a side note, as I was editing, I said I lived in Florida for 6 years. It was actually 8 years, with 6 years being in South Florida. It kind of bugged me that I made that slip, so I wanted to mention that here. All right, on to the episode.
So maybe if you wanted to start, introduce yourself. I mean, I don't know if you're from Florida originally, or I think you lived in Colorado a little bit. So maybe kind of just how you got into plants and nature and where you evolved from.
Yeah, I am actually from Tallahassee. I was born here. And I did live in Colorado and Montana for a little while, both of those places, but ended up back in Tallahassee. And so I got into plants most likely because my dad, was always pointing out plants to me. His dad was the head of the Department of Citrus and Exotics in Florida, back in the maybe 30s and 40s.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and his mom, my grandmother, she was a plant enthusiast and had a great big greenhouse in her backyard and all kinds of fruit trees, and she was very active in her orchid society locally. And so I think my dad grew up really seeing plants and noticing plants and appreciating them, and he provided that for me. I think most people don't really see plants. It's kind of like a background for animals.
Yes.
And one of my goals in having the Instagram account that I have and Facebook and everything is just helping people to notice and observe and appreciate, because if people don't know and appreciate and love the plants in our eco regions of Florida, then they won't, make an effort to conserve them. And that's critically important to me and life in general.
Yes.
But,
I'm sorry, go ahead.
So I was thinking about it today, and I first purchased a bunch of bulbs. I became obsessed with bulbs in high school. And then in college, we're right out of high school, I started growing veggies, vegetable plants. And my mom was diagnosed with early onset Alzheimer's when I was in middle school. So my dad and I became very close, taking care of her, and gardening and sitting outside with my plants was an extremely cathartic environment for me, and was something that really was healing, and that I found solace in. And I, ended up working at a native plant nursery, and I was obsessed with veggies and organic farming. And from that, I started becoming interested in native plants, mostly because I was interested in foraging for native plants.
Mm-hmm.
And then I kind of spread out from there. And I'm seeing that path. I've seen a lot of young people taking that path where they're interested in vegetable gardening, and they become interested in foraging, and then they start appreciating native plants because they're out looking at them.
Right. So did you end up in college going for like a botany or horticulture degree, or how did that happen?
Yes, so I have no official degree in any sort of biological field. I went to school for international relations with the emphasis on political science, and I dropped out of school because my mom was sick and she was dying, and it was a really difficult time for me. And it just wasn't a priority, and the more I matured, I think the less I was interested in international relations and more interested in, life around me.
Right. Yeah, that definitely seems like a big deviation from, enjoying your plants as a teen. And I think so many of us probably go to college doing what we think we should do, not what we really want to do. So,
Yeah, and I also think, I just didn't really know what my interests were yet. But I found that being around plants and working with plants was really satisfying and cathartic for me. Like, again, I was going through a difficult time and it was really healing for me. And so
right.
I found that was really important. Um, yeah.
So since you were self-taught, basically, what kind of resources did you have to learn? I mean, you probably had mentors
Yeah.
in real life, but was there any? I mean, this is probably early days of the online world, which is, rapidly different than it was even 10 years ago. So, yeah, how did all that happen too?
Well, so I was working at a native plant nursery and I became manager of the nursery, and I joined the local chapter of the Florida Native Plant Society, and I started going to their meetings, and I started meeting more people, and I went on field trips that the Native Plant Society took, people out on. And that's how I met, a diverse group of plant enthusiasts and botanists. And a lot of those people became mentors for me. And I would go out, my friends Eleanor Dietrich and Floyd Griffith, I would go out on Sundays with them. I would have to find another sideline to my life story is that my dad ended up getting sick with dementia after my mom passed away.
Oh, no.
So by the time I started really becoming interested and obsessed with native plants, my dad had dementia and had moved in with me, and I was caregiving for him. I've been a caregiver for most of my life. And so going out in nature with Floyd and Eleanor on Sundays, we would go out to the National Forest or other areas around, was just such a wonderful experience for me. And just, it was like the beacon of light in my life at the time. And that's how I started learning plants, was from other people.
Right. Now, did it seem like difficult to learn about, the actual plant parts and, detailed taxonomy and all of that? Or what did you do to like learn all of that?
Yeah, well, I read books. And the more I needed to know in order to identify plants, to separate species, and it's called keying out a plant using a dichotomous key to identify what genus and what species a plant is, the more I had to learn all of those terms. And so I just read. I think a lot of people in my generation are, self-taught and learn because they have a passion and interest in something. And so I did. And I did want to mention a book that has been really useful to me, and that it's called Botany in a Day, the patterns
of
plant identification. And that was a great book to give me the basis that I didn't have of plant biological knowledge in order to like understand the plants more.
Right. So what places were you going around to hike in Tallahassee? I mean, you're going to I'm sure the local national forest, but what other cool places are around Tallahassee that people might be unaware of?
Yeah, well, we have the Munson Sandhills, which are really like 10-minute drive from my house. And I am not a hiker, but I am a biker. I love biking, and I've done several bike packing trips with my partner where we are camping and biking off trail and or on trail off road. And so there are bike trails just south of town, and there's a St. Mark's National Wildlife Refuge just maybe about 25 minutes from my house in Tallahassee. And both of those places are just, filled with diverse plant and animal life.
So I guess more broadly speaking, as you're learning all the plants, you're learning about the ecosystems of the region. Were you aware, like growing up, just like what kind of special habitats were around in Florida? I mean, a lot of people probably realize, a lot of things from South Florida that are, special, like the Everglades and Big Cypress. Yeah. But I think people might tend to, just look at North Florida as being, South Georgia and turn their nose up to that. So when did it kind of become apparent to you? Probably when you were doing your hikes with the Florida Native Plant Society, but just how important some of these ecosystems and landscapes were. And I guess maybe discuss a little bit about the ecosystems of North Florida.
Yeah, it's such a special area. And I started learning about it through going to talks at the Native Plant Society and then researching and reading more about it. And I was just so shocked to realize that I grew up and was living in such a special biodiverse area. And I never learned any of those things in school. We learned about European history and like probably some stuff about the history of America, but I think there was a real lack of local information, because when I learned that, for instance, there's a geological feature that bisects east to west Tallahassee, the city I live in, and it's right around where the Capitol building is, and south of this feature, it's called the Cody Scarp. The habitat becomes very flat, sandy, with some limestone outcroppings, but mostly pine. And then north of that feature are the Red Hills, which are more clayey, rolling hills with pine also, but also hardwood hammocks, and very different topography. And when I found out that that's because the Cody Scarp is the prehistoric coastline, I was just like blown away that this prehistoric coastline, I was traveling back and forth across it my whole life. And I never knew it was there. And I had never really even noticed that there were these vastly different environments north and south of town. And it's one of the reasons why the south side of town has always been less economically, it's the north side of town with the clay soils are where all of the plantations were. It was the rich soils that were good for growing. And so all of that land was bought up by rich plantation owners and used to grow. And so the south side of Florida was always, much poorer. South side of Tallahassee was always much poorer. And that was really interesting to me. I read a book that is still one of my favorite books called The Other Florida. And it's about Tallahassee and the Panhandle in general. And it was written in 1964 by a woman who was a New York journalist, and her husband got a job at FSU, and she moved here like right after desegregation. And she was a kind of a naturalist, and she fell in love with the Panhandle, and she wrote this book and had all of these chapters on different topics, like, the Toria State Park area, and the sorry, my dogs are distracting me here, and the different regions and different histories of the area, like the turpentine camps that were still active when she was living here.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So so I learned about those things, and then I started learning that the Panhandle is one of the most biodiverse regions in America. And it's because we have all of these different distinct habitats that meet in one relatively small area. And those different habitats have very different plant and animal species. And the regions in between the habitats that are varying from one habitat to another they're called ecotones. Mm-hmm. And those little regions are well known all over the world for being areas of special biodiversity. So with all of the ecotones in the area, because these habitats are meeting up, and then very different habitats in general, the Panhandle is just an extremely biodiverse area and really special and unique.
Right. I definitely regret that one thing with my short 6 years in Florida, that we did not get to the Panhandle as much. We were kind of stuck down in Miami and Fort Lauderdale so much that, it's a lot longer of a drive than you expect to get up that way.
Yeah.
And so we spent a little bit of time in Apalachicola once, and did a few things, but not nearly as much time. And then when we hiked through on the Florida Trail, we were just amazed at just how cool North Florida was. And it's something that I would love to get back to. And it's actually, I'm in Houston now, and it's kind of funny because, I can drive 10 hours and get to Florida pretty fast, or I can go 10 hours and still be in Texas and, the West Texas. So it's like, well, we go to West Texas, or I can go to Florida, either way.
So diversity in West Texas, actually. But yes. Yeah. But yeah, I know I look back and think, man, I can't believe, I kind of regret that my parents didn't teach me more about our environment and take me out to explore and see where I was living, or the history of the Native Americans in the area, which I really don't know that much about, but I, have read quite a bit about it. But so the more I started seeing these vastly different ecosystems and the really cool plants and animals that were in them, and actually using social media, it made me realize, like, oh my gosh, other people in the country do not have all of these plants. And I'm posting constantly year round cool stuff that is blooming or growing or in seed, and I just see the same the same type of plants that people are continuing to post over and over again for the rest of the East Coast. At least I know there are different biodiverse regions in the U.S., like in Southern California and such. But I just feel so lucky to be living here, and I try to get out as much as possible. I have not explored the peninsula much at all because I was caring for my dad for so long. And I have explored some of the Western Panhandle, but I have spent a lot of time in the Apalachicola National Forest, which is about an hour drive from my house, and Toria State Park, which is about an hour drive. And north of Toria, there's Chattahoochee, which has these incredibly rare and weird limestone glades that have super rare plants on them as well and are real unique. So yeah, I just feel incredibly lucky to be living in this area.
Yeah, you could drive just about an hour each direction and hit somewhere really cool to explore.
Yeah, the Swanee River is just to the east, and
Yeah.
that's a lot of fun. All the springs along the Swanee and, the various plants and animals that are in that area as well.
I do. You mentioned the Torreya State Park. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that because I don't know if a lot of people understand the significance of that state park and what the plant species there that is so important, and what Hurricane Michael did to that state park, and maybe actually you might have an update on like how that is all recovering a little bit too.
Yeah. So I recently I got a job with the Florida Native Plant Society, which I'm so excited about because, what a dream. And I am working on the Torreya Keepers project. And that is a project that is, we are mapping, monitoring Torreya trees and existing trees, and we're working with landowners, private landowners in the area who might have trees on their property or who know they have trees on their property, so we can monitor them as well. And then we're also planting Torreya out there. And I'll tell you a little bit about the park before I go into the plant nerdiness. But so that book, The Other Florida by Gloria Jehoda, she has a section on it about the Garden of Eden right here in Florida. So I guess the Southern Baptists in the region, the Torreya tree, which is very rare and really only occurs along the Apalachicola River. It's common. One of the common names is gopher wood. And apparently in the Bible, Noah's Ark was built from gopher wood, a tree called gopher wood.
Mm-hmm.
And so they naturally assumed that the Garden of Eden was originally right here in Florida. And that's why Torreya State Park has a trail called the Garden of Eden Trail, which is, kind of interesting local facts.
Yeah.
But so the Torreya tree used to be, the state park is along the Apalachicola River, and the Apalachicola River basin is very diverse. There's a lot of plants that occur further north in the Carolinas that are disjunct and also occur down here. And then there are plants that probably used to occur, in history at some point further up in the Carolinas, but went extinct up there and evolved and continued to grow down here, like the Torreya tree. And so one thing is I grew up saying Torreya because that's what I learned, but apparently the correct pronunciation is Torreya because the tree is named after John Torrey.
Okay.
Yeah, described that plant. So, so the Torreya tree was a plant. It's a conifer that is very, very rare. And it really, like I said, only occurs along the Apalachicola River, but may have historically occurred further north. And right around the 30s, 40s, people started noticing them dying. And by the 1960s, virtually every mature tree were dead. And the trees died back to the ground, and they might resprout from the roots, but they would only get so big before dying back again. And it was a very common tree there, actually. So the loss of the tree had, all sorts of ripple effects on the environment. And several, botanists started trying to figure out why it was disappearing. Why was it dying? And they eventually pinpointed a fungus, a fusarium fungus, that was killing it. And they thought if they took it out of the environment and grew it in other places, that it might persist in other places. But what they eventually found out is that the fungus is actually inherent to the tree. It only occurs with the tree, although it can spread to other plants. And so the tree likely evolved with the fungus, and the fungus, the Fusarium, really isn't the cause of the death of the trees. The trees became stressed, and for some reason, they don't really, that has yet to be discovered, what changed in their environment that caused them to be stressed. And then just like when we're stressed, our immune system is compromised and we're more likely to get, diseases or have issues. So plants are similar in that they don't have the immune systems, but if they're stressed for various reasons, then they're more susceptible to pest and disease. And so the Fusarium, when the trees are stressed, takes over and kills back the plant. Yeah, so it's a weird and still a lot to learn about what is actually going on, and that's why it's important to keep these trees and keep the diversity of the genetic stock of them available for future.
Well, and I think it's a lesson for other species and habitats too, because you don't know, you could have something that's seemingly doing well, even if it's, a small population, but it's pretty healthy, and then just one little thing can turn it all on its head, and then you're having a loss of the bromeliad weevils down south, destroying some of those populations. So it's just how tenuous of a balance it all is.
Yeah, like the loss of the American chestnut in the east was devastating and completely forever changed the environments. And I'm sure we lost many species of plants and animals because of that change. Yeah. And then one of the other things I wanted to mention too is, talking about these different habitats and everything. I also grew up, going out in the woods and the Tallahassee area and seeing these kind of thickety, overgrown woods that had a lot of vines that were difficult to navigate through. And I thought that was like natural. And I was astonished to learn that that's not natural. That's not what the landscape would have looked like. And that fire is actually critically important to the functioning of Florida ecosystems. And 80% of Florida historically would have burned naturally on a 1 to 4 year return rate. Not necessarily all at once, obviously, but the areas would be burned. And those fires would have been started by lightning, or it's also known that Native Americans used fire as well. And so learning about the fire suppression that started happening in the 40s when Smokey the Bear came around and said, wildfires are bad. And, and, it took them a while to figure out, lots of people already knew at that point, but were not being heard. That fire is essential to Florida landscapes. And many of our natural areas, like the National Forest, were forever changed because of fire suppression. And I spend a lot of my time, not on trails, but on power lines and roadsides looking at plants, because the mowing of road signs and power lines mimics what fire does for the landscape, which is take out the hardwood trees and shrubby plants that would shade out our native grasses and perennial wildflowers, etc. Right. So a lot of our rare native species, like the milkweeds that I'm so obsessed with, uh, are just persisting, barely hanging on in these small little populations along roadsides and power lines.
So other than hanging out in roadsides and power lines, I know you get out, you mentioned you get out to Apalachicola quite a bit and St. Mark's somewhat. Um, can you talk a little bit about the ecosystems in each of those areas? I know obviously they're quite different because one's pretty much on the coast, but what kind of plants and other species are you finding when you're out exploring? Or is there anything you're out there particularly looking for, or do you just often go and just look to see what may be blooming?
Yeah, I do both, but I have a particular obsession for carnivorous plants and also our native milkweeds, which Florida is extremely diverse in milkweed species. And we have 21 that are native to Florida, and 2 of which are endemic to Florida. Only endemic means they only occur there in Florida. And so, I spend a lot of time going out specifically looking for plants and then also just wandering and hoping to find something. But the St. Mark's National Wildlife Refuge, that is very diverse habitat, and they've been burning there pretty well. And so there are a lot of plants there. There are a lot of milkweeds there. And the National Forest is known for its carnivorous plant diversity. It's one of the most biodiverse places in the world for carnivorous plants. And people come from all over the world to see them in the National Forest. And so carnivorous plants are just really cool and a very charismatic, type of plant. And there are many different genera that are not necessarily closely related in evolutionary terms, but have evolved similar ways of surviving in these very nutrient-poor areas, and which is getting nutrients from insects. So there are all sorts of different types of carnivorous plants, and I love going out there to look at them.
Yeah, that's definitely the highlight of Apalachicola for sure. And I think most people probably, if they're, hiking on the trail, they're going to see pitcher plants and they may or may not know what that's about. But there's other, smaller, more diminutive carnivorous plants as well. Can you talk about those too?
Yeah, so there are actually pitcher plants that lie prostrate on the ground. And there are also other carnivorous plant species like sundews and butterworts, which are pinguiculus. And all of these plants typically occur in the same areas because they're taking advantage of an area where there's less competition from other plant species because the soil is so nutrient poor. And they've adapted and evolved to withstand that lack of nutrients by eating insects, like I said before. But the sundews and the butterworts have a different method of catching insects. They have like sticky substances, sticky glands on their leaves, and the glands actually secrete digestive enzymes that allow them to, one, they're sticky so the insects get caught on them, and then 2, they're able to digest and absorb nutrients from the insects right on their leaves.
I knew a little bit about that, but still just thinking about that is just really cool. And if you're walking along and you don't really know what you're looking at and just thinking that plant is absorbing, dead bugs.
I will never forget the first time I saw pitcher plants in the National Forest. We have Sarracenia flava, which is the yellow top pitcher plant. And it is a big plant. We have a subspecies called Sarracenia flava var rugelii, and they can get, 3.5 feet tall, the big pitchers. And the pitchers are actually modified leaves that are modified to be these tubes, and they have digestive enzymes down at the base of them, and they catch insects in there. and absorb the nutrients from them. But they're, if any of your listeners haven't seen them before, they should really look them up because, man, they are just this beautiful lime green color. And it's just unreal to see this whole stand of these tall, weird pictures. They look like marching soldiers of some otherworldly place. And man, it is just such an experience. And, you know, when I first saw them, I didn't even realize how special it was to see them because I didn't realize that they don't occur in most other areas. You know.
Right. So other than, carnivorous plants and milkweeds, what are some of your favorite plants in North Florida or in some of these regions that we're discussing?
Oh, I mean, there are some really cool native trees that only occur along the Apalachicola River, like the Florida yew, which is another really rare conifer, and the ash magnolia, which is a deciduous magnolia species that has massive leaves that can get to be like 1.5 feet long.
Wow.
And the blooms are like the size of a dinner plate. They're massive, big, extremely fragrant blooms that are white with a lilac purpley star at the center of the bloom. And so, yeah, I love all of those plants, and I love to explore, the rare plants on the limestone glades in the Chattahoochee area. Yeah, there are just so many things. It'd be hard to list them all.
Well, is there anything that someone hiking along the Florida Trail in, either St. Mark's or Apalachicola that would, other than pitcher plants that, that they could keep an eye out for, that they would be able to recognize? If I, put a link in the show notes, they would be like, okay, I can keep an eye out for these. Obviously, probably a, January, February kind of bloom time or even just a tree species. Is there anything that off the top of your head you can think of?
Well, January and February there's not a whole lot of things blooming. You'll see all kinds of cool plants not in bloom, but there's not as many. And the ones that are can be difficult to find, like the wiregrass gentian, which blooms in winter and but is, I mean, even for me, very hard to spot, even though I know there's one 10 feet around me somewhere. So I was thinking about that, and I was like, it just depends so much on where you are at and what time of year. But what I would encourage your listeners to do if they're interested is there's an app called iNaturalist. Mm-hmm. Have you heard of it?
Yes, I use it all the time.
Yeah. So that's a great app for beginners learning what plants are around them, even in their yard. And if you saw something cool on the Florida Trail, you could take a picture of it, and then later when you have Wi-Fi, you can upload it, and the photo has location data, so it can tell you, along with the photo algorithms the app have, what is that plant is most likely to be. So I think that's a great tool for beginners to start learning and exploring what they're seeing around them.
Right. Yeah, I started using iNaturalist. I was a little resistant at first a few years ago, and mostly because I didn't want to deal with my phone so much. But then I realized the power of the app is really on the desktop version. I feel like that's even the better way to use it. So when I started using it as more of a desktop method, I have fallen in love with it. And definitely when I went to Florida back in January, I looked up the hooded pitcher plants at Split Oak Forest, and I was like, I'm gonna go find me some. Yeah. So I use it as that method, which is probably a good and a bad thing when you go into thinking about plant poaching and wanting to not necessarily make all of your plant locations known, but it's definitely helpful if you want to learn a little bit.
Yeah, that is one of the reasons why I was hesitant to start using iNaturalist, because plant poaching is such a big deal in this area, because carnivorous plants are highly coveted by obsessive collectors, and the plants in this area in the Western Panhandle are so unique, and so valuable, like very valuable, that they get poached pretty fairly often, and it's really depressing to see that. And so when I take a photo and share it online, I make sure that there's no location data in the photo, and the only information about the area that I am willing to give is the county that I was in. And when I use iNaturalist, I obscure the location or make it private so that people, and the other thing when you're using iNaturalist is even if you're identifying common species near the rare species, you still need to obscure that information because people could figure out where you were,
Oh, yeah. Yeah. True. I hadn't thought about that, but that is very, very wise to think about. Now, are you going out you seem like you're out quite frequently during the week. I know since you're working with the Florida Native Plant Society now that you're probably out a lot more frequently than you may have used to been going. But I guess, yeah, how often are your expeditions to botanize?
Yeah, I like to get out, even just to go to St. Mark's or Munson, Sandhills for sunset or for an evening walk. And you just see so much stuff if you look around you. And then on the weekends or during the week when I'm working for the Native Plant Society, I explore, I take a day and go to the National Forest or go to the Western Panhandle and camp out there or, do a long day trip. So I try to get out as much as possible, and really it's for my own sanity because I'm sure hikers experience the same things. It's like it is just so good for your soul to be out in nature, and it takes me out of my own head and my own thoughts and worries and obsessions, and it allows me to see that there's a whole world around me and that I'm just a little speck and a part of it all. And I, don't have to feel so stressed. And it's just the pure awe of seeing the beauty and diversity of plants. And I really love to see genetic diversity within a population of plants. Like, say, there's a bunch of, a certain type of milkweed, like clasping milkweed in an area. And you can see slight genetic diversity between individuals that are visible, like coloration of the blooms or size of the plant or shape of the leaves. I love to see that. And that diversity is what makes these species as a whole more adaptable to change in their environment. Right.
Is there a particular habitat you prefer exploring in, or you spend more of your time in than others?
I mean, I love going to see pitcher plants in the seepage slopes of the Western Panhandle and the wet prairies and the National Forest. There's just something about those open, vast grasslands with a few pine trees that is just so beautiful. And to see all of these weird, carnivorous plants occurring in them, and all sorts of also native terrestrial orchids occur in those areas. And also rare milkweeds occur in those areas. So, they're kind of like it's kind of ecstasy for me to go to a pitcher plant bog and just sit and watch and listen and enjoy.
Now, have you kind of evolved? I mean, I think you post sometimes about the insect species you see, but I guess you're really interested in the plants. Have you started to try to learn about how it all connects with everything else, like with the insects, with any other animals and species like that? Or I know it's really hard for me because, I feel like I try to get involved and want to learn one thing, and then I let everything else kind of go because I'm focused on this, and then you slowly add in little pieces. I don't know how it is for you.
Yeah. Well, when you start photographing plants, you start noticing, even in the field, you might not notice a little crab spider on a bloom. But then you get back to your house and you look at photos and you're like, wow,
Mhm.
there is a spider there that is the exact same color of this bloom. And it makes me curious. And so then I look it up and learn more about them. And so I've learned more about insects. Insects are just so diverse. The diversity of insects is way over my head.
Yeah.
So, just I've never delved too deeply into them, but I like to learn the ones that I see most often so I know what they are. And I see a lot of specific types of bees on milkweeds and specific types of beetles on milkweeds, and of course, I love butterflies. And yeah, I do love insects as well. And at the nursery I work at, I've taught, pollinator workshops about native species, because so often when people talk about pollinators, they assume you're talking about honeybees, which are not native,
Right.
are European. And our native pollinators are so critical, and they are declining rapidly. And so, yeah, increasing habitat by planting native plants in your own yard, taking out invasive species, and replacing non-native species with native plants it's becoming critically important, because we are all able to survive only because we rely on these ecosystem services that are provided by functioning ecosystems, like clean air and clean water and decomposition and buffers for extreme weather. Functioning ecosystems are critical to human survival, and our ecosystems are failing all over the world. And we as humans have to recognize that our yards and gardens are not ours. They're a part of a whole that needs to be functioning in order for our survival as well.
Mhm.
And I read a lot, and so I'm going to mention another book. Um, but the book Bringing Nature Home by Doug Challey just completely changed my life, and really inspired me to spread the message of planting native plants and spreading the message of conserving and connecting um, preserved habitat for species, because one of the big issues in America is what's called habitat fragmentation, which means we are having fewer and fewer natural areas, and they are separated from each other. And so those species, the gene pool of both the plants and animals, becomes more and more shallow, and that makes them more susceptible um, to extinction.
Mhm.
Uh,
I think one of the things in that book, Bringing Nature Home, that really struck me was how many species rely on oak trees.
yeah.
Like how many insects rely on them. And then I even thought about growing up, my parents being worried about, webworms and the trees, and they would spray the trees, and now I'm like, don't spray the trees.
Yeah.
They're just caterpillars. They're going to defoliate for, a period of a month or so, and then they're going to turn into moths, and it'll be great. um, but yeah, that was a very eye-opening book. I agree with you.
Oaks and pines are by far the most important members of the southeast ecosystems, and they support more wildlife than anything else. And those oaks in particular host 557 species of Lepidoptera, which are moths and butterflies. And people, they dislike caterpillars. They like butterflies, but they don't want the caterpillars eating their plants. But those caterpillars the insects are just so critical for the entire food chain. They are what turn green things like leaves into protein in the form of themselves for the rest of the food chain. And bird species, which songbirds are on a steep decline as well. Birds rely on caterpillars, especially. And so all of these facts are from Bringing Nature Home, but he states in there that, on average per day, like a nesting pair of bluebirds brings about 500 caterpillars back to the nest to feed their babies. Yeah. And so if you have a yard with crepe myrtles and boxwood and centipede lawn, you are not supporting any birds in your area. And and you will not, even if you put a feeder out for them, baby birds, 96% of bird species in America, their babies can eat exclusively insects. They don't eat seeds or berries. And so planting some non-native berry-producing tree or shrub does nothing for the survival of our bird species.
Yeah. So I think all of that kind of brings me to my next question is, what kind of environmental impacts is the Panhandle facing? I know like a lot of the attention gets talked about for the peninsula, the upcoming potential toll roads and, development. Is development as a big of an issue in the Tallahassee area as it is for the rest of the state? Or is there any other big projects that are threatening any particular open spaces in that area?
None in particular come to mind right away, but development is just a continuing problem for all of Florida and all of the country and all of the world. And the Panhandle has been preserved from a lot of that. We're lucky to have a lot of state parks and national forests and national wildlife refuges, and those areas are preserved. But the habitat management has been an issue, because even if you preserve those areas, if you aren't burning them at a regular interval, or if you don't burn for a long enough period, and the habitat can no longer burn effectively, then you're still losing all those species. Mm-hmm. And so habitat loss from development is by far the number one cause of loss of biodiversity and species. But it's also maintaining the habitat that we do have left and managing it well. You can't just leave it alone. It has to be managed. And that also means like protecting our roadsides, which are, refuge for so many species that are just barely hanging on, and, working with the Department of Transportation to mow at the right times and at the right intervals and not use herbicide, which has been an increasing problem in all of the Southeast, is herbicide use on the roadsides. Mm-hmm. And yeah, so it can be very, very overwhelming and depressing, as I'm sure you know.
Yes, definitely.
But I think, I do think that sharing my love for these plants and my appreciation for them and helping other people to see their beauty is really important, because, if they don't know that those plants are there, they aren't willing to make the effort to vote to protect land.
Right. That has definitely been my experience, is that you can't just necessarily talk to somebody and say such and such is very important. You have to make it important to them too. And then that's how it changes. And then it's a lot harder to do it that way, but it's when it's important to everybody else is when that gets protected. Yeah. So it's definitely an uphill battle for sure.
And these unique environments are, money-making places. They draw people from all over the world to see both our flora and fauna, because we have such great biodiversity in birds and butterflies and plants as well. So people, preserving these areas could be, beneficial for the state of Florida as well.
Right. Now, you mentioned you hadn't had a chance to really explore the peninsula or western panhandle, but is there anywhere in particular you would like to visit, in the next upcoming years, or maybe even that's on your highlight list for, I don't know, when this pandemic
Yeah.
ends?
Well, I'd love to go to the Lake Wales Ridge in
Oh, yeah.
central South Florida. That's a very unique with extreme biological diversity because it's a former island. And so all of these plants evolved uh, by themselves for such a long period of time. They developed really unique species there. And I'd love to see those. And there's still two species of native milkweeds I've never seen because they only occur in the peninsula. And that's the Curtis's milkweed, Asclepias curtisi, and the Florida milkweed, Asclepias fayei. So hopefully, depends on this pandemic, I really wanted to see them this year, but that I don't know if that's going to be able to happen.
Yeah.
I,
Yeah.
I also would love to spend more time in the Everglades. I did a bike ride with my partner in the Fakahatchee Strand, and I loved it down there. It's so different. But yeah, I'd love to learn more about those areas.
Yeah, I was going to ask if you did any kind of swamp hiking, if you went to, any of the Tai sloughs or like hiked in Bradwell Bay or anything like that.
I have done not all that much, no, because those areas aren't necessarily super biodiverse for like plants.
Okay.
But I certainly have spent a good amount of time in in some moccasin-rich swamps. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. If you ever do get to go back to South Florida, definitely Fakahatchee is a
Yeah.
highlight. So
Yeah, I have some friends down there that will take me out to see all the cool stuff, and I can't wait, but pandemic.
yes.
One of the things I wanted to mention, which is also a critical problem, after development for Florida habitat, is invasive plant species,
Yes.
and in Central and South Florida, invasive, animal species are also a real problem. But when I drove down to do that bike ride in the Fakahatchee Strand, I could not believe the amount of Kogan grass that was covering miles and miles of roadside down there. And Kogan grass is, I think, in my opinion, by far the most worrisome and threatening invasive species that we have. And I would love everyone who is hiking on a trail to learn what Kogan grass looks like so they can ID it and report it, because it is very scary. It grows so thickly in both full sun and full shade and wet soils and dry soils, and it covers the landscape and pushes out every other plant besides the already established trees. And it is also fire adapted, so having prescribed burns doesn't get rid of it, which is a cure for some of our invasive species, burning regularly. But it's actually extremely flammable, and it's one of the common names for it is petrol grass, because a little spark can ignite it, and it burns. When it does burn, it burns so hot that it sterilizes the soil, and so it destroys the seed bank of native species. Yeah. So, yeah, that's definitely my number one invasive hit list. And I use yet another app that I love called I've Got One, and it you can just take a photo of Kogan grass or another invasive species, and it has the location data, and you enter like a tiny amount of information, like how much area is covered, and then you can upload that, and that information is then available for governmental agencies to be alerted to new populations and to get a hold of populations before they become unmanageable, because once they really take hold, it can be extremely difficult to eradicate. That's the real scary thing about Kogan grass is once it takes hold. I was talking to a invasive plant expert from the Nature Conservancy, and he said he had never seen a population of Kogan grass eradicated.
Oh, wow. That's really definitely scary.
Yeah. So he said it is possible, but it takes such regular returns of herbicide at the right time in order to finally, hopefully, eradicate it. So reporting new populations is critically important.
Yeah, I knew it was a problem in South Florida before we left, but I didn't realize it had spread that far and wide. Was mostly focused on like Brazilian pepper and melaleuca and that sort of thing, but I didn't realize it had gotten that bad.
Yeah, you guys in South Florida have some already terrible invasive species that have totally changed the landscape. But in North Florida, we have some, but not quite as bad as South Florida. But in the last 5 years, the spread of Kogan grass, how rapidly it spreads, it can grow extremely quickly. And it has just frightened me. I see it every day now. No matter where I go, I see it. And I use that app to report populations of it. Mm-hmm. And I'll re-report populations of it even because sometimes governmental agencies might treat it and then they think that it's gone and don't know that they need to go back to treat it again.
Now, do you guys have Chinese tallow? Is it bad in the Panhandle yet?
Yeah, it's definitely bad. Is that bad down south as well?
No. Well, here in Houston, it's probably to me, it's one of the number one invasives, and I feel like the state and land management, nobody's doing anything for it. And we have, Texas has, a Texas invasive site, and I know they spray for, water hyacinth and things like that, but I don't feel like there's any big push for eliminating invasives like there is in Florida, at least. And tallow, I feel, is just taking over southeast Houston, Beaumont, definitely into Louisiana as well. And I just didn't know how bad it had gotten over in Florida.
It is bad. It's definitely the worst in suburban areas, urban areas in general, any kind of disturbed area. It's been here for so long. There are many very well established large trees that people are unwilling to take out because they're pretty, and they look kind of like oaks because they're so big and beautiful, but they are producing boatloads of seed that may be eaten by mammals and birds and then further spread. And they're one of the best things about going out to these hard to reach natural areas that you might see on the Florida Trail is that you don't often see invasive plants in those areas. But just this Saturday or Sunday, I was out in the National Forest helping a friend do a rare plant survey, and I saw a large population of camphor out there. So, yeah.
It's hiding.
Yeah. So the big invasive tree species in North Florida are camphor trees and tallow trees.
Okay. So if people are interested in learning a little bit more about North Florida, do you have any resources, whether they're just hikers passing through or maybe living in North Florida, what would you recommend people to read or to visit websites, things like that?
So if you're just kind of curious and you like local history, I definitely recommend that book, The Other Florida by Gloria Jehoda. It has a really unique history of the Panhandle. But if you're more interested in like the environments and the habitats and the plants and animal species that occur in them, and where exactly they are and how they differ and change, there's an agency called the Florida Natural Areas Inventory, known as FNA, and they have put out a wonderful book called The Atlas of Florida's Natural Heritage. And that is it's a beautiful book. It has a lot of cool pictures, and it also goes into depth about the geology of Florida, the geography, everything, all of the endangered plants and animals. It's a really comprehensive book, and it's not that big. It's amazing to me how much they fit into this book. But I think would be a really useful one for anyone who's really interested in knowing about the regions.
Okay. Now, if they want to just follow what you're doing and learn by social media, where can they follow you?
I'm on Instagram. So Lilium is the genus for the lilies, and my first name is Lily, and so, my middle name is Bird, and so my handle on Instagram is Lilium Bird, and then on Facebook I'm Lily Bird, and it's BYRD. It's a family name. That is my middle name.
Okay. Yeah, I've loved your Instagram handle, and it's a beautiful name. So you have a beautiful name.
Yeah, I think it's a fitting name for my interests.
Definitely. And I was wondering, because you mentioned earlier your family was just kind of into plants and all of that. I wondered if that was how you got your name.
It's actually a family name. My great grandmother from Enigma, Georgia, was named Lily, and
Okay.
so I received that name from her. So,
Okay. Well, thank you so much for taking the time out to talk about North Florida a little bit. I hope it gives people a little bit of an insight into, that area, St. Mark's, Apalachicola, when they're walking through, maybe if they make a detour to Tallahassee for a day off the trail. I definitely want to just have other voices in Florida to talk a little bit about it. And I think you were the right person to do that for this region. So I appreciate you doing that.
Yeah, I think hiking the Florida Trail in the Panhandle is just such an excellent experience of going through many different ecoregions that are very distinct and diverse. And if you pay attention to what you're walking around, you could really have some exciting experiences.
All right, well, thank you, and hopefully you will be able to go and hike somewhere soon outside of your local area with this crazy pandemic. So
Yeah, I hope so too.
That's it for my chat with Lily. You can find the show notes for the episode at orangeblaze.thegardenpathpodcast.com, and the podcast can be found on Instagram as Orange Blaze Podcast and on Facebook as Official Orange Blaze Podcast. Happy hiking, and maybe plant some native plants during your non-hiking time.